Sounds good. Okay, welcome everyone to this online panel discussion. My name is Koen Stoop. I'm the EU representative of the World Uyghur Congress, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today, the World Uyghur Congress is launching its 2020 annual report, which sets out the past year's most important developments with regards to the Uyghur human rights crisis. The report documents an alarming depiction of the reality that Uyghurs and other Turkic people in the region continue to face, paying particular attention to China's zero COVID policy, forced labor, arbitrary detention, and transnational repression. Some of these important events include the Urumqi fire, the leaked Xinjiang police files, alarming extradition requests in Morocco and Saudi Arabia, and a publication of various reports that expose the links between global supply chains and Uyghur forced labor. At the same time, the report also documents the international community's increased efforts to address these human rights abuses and to hold those responsible to account. While the introduction of relevant legislation, such as import bans and the establishment of legal complaints, address the complicity of the business community, credible assessments from the United Nations and the Independent Uyghur Tribunal have added to findings of crimes against humanity and genocide being committed. Finally, the report's numerous recommendations provide a way forward for the international community to act in a meaningful way to end this genocide. Today's event aims to discuss this ongoing dire situation for the Uyghur people and how multilateral institutions, national governments, and civil society have increased their crucial efforts to address these human rights atrocities. We are therefore delighted to have a panel of brilliant speakers who all have played an important role to address the Uyghur genocide and to press for justice and accountability. Samir Saberi is a Canadian Member of Parliament who was elected to represent the federal riding of Pierrefonds-Dollard in the House of Commons in the 2019 federal election as a member of the Liberal Party. He's a chair of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development and the vice chair of Scrutiny of the Regulations Committee. He has been co-chair of the bipartisan Canadian Uyghur Parliamentary Friendship Group and one of the leading voices in Canada and within the Canadian Liberal Party on Uyghur human rights, which has already led to the adoption of a motion recognizing the Uyghur genocide in October 2020. Rafael Viana David has worked at the International Service for Human Rights since 2018 and currently holds the position of China and Latin American advocate. Rafael is responsible for the ISHR's monitoring and advocacy on China at the United Nations Human Rights Council and provides support to Chinese, Uyghur, Tibetan, and Hong Kong human rights defenders in accessing the UN system. He is French-Brazilian and holds a dual master's degree in human rights and international relations from Sciences Po Paris and Peking University. Hélène de Rangel holds 20 years of experience in managing, advocating, and fundraising for national and international nonprofit organizations. She held different positions in the field of the rehabilitation of torture victims, where she worked from 2001 until 2014 in different national and international functions. From 2014 to 2016, she worked for ECPAT International on the fight against sexual exploitation of children, and from 2016 to 2018, she successfully led the Program Coordination Unit of Protection International in support of human rights defenders across 3 continents. Since 2020, she leads the advocacy work of Anti-Slavery International in Brussels, with a focus on business and human rights issues. Sumurtai Arkin is the Program and Advocacy Manager and a spokesperson of the World Uyghur Congress. She leads the World Uyghur Congress's international advocacy, primarily at the United Nations. This includes engagement with different UN treaty bodies, special procedures, the Office of the High Commissioner, diplomatic missions, as well as civil society organizations. She also offers commentary to international media. And finally, Dolken Issa is the president of the World Uyghur Congress. He was a former student leader of pro-democracy protests at Xinjiang University in 1988 and founded the Students' Science and Culture Union at the university, working on programs to eliminate illiteracy, promote science, and lead other students in East Turkestan. After enduring persecution from the Chinese government, he fled China in 1994 and became a German citizen in 2006. He has since been advocating for Uyghur human rights in front of the UN and EU institutions, international governments, and international human rights organizations. He has worked to mobilize the Uyghur diaspora community to collectively advocate for their rights and the rights of Uyghurs in East Turkestan. Before I give the floor to Mr. Issa for opening remarks, I would just like to highlight a few housekeeping rules. As we all know now, this discussion is live streamed on our YouTube channel. And at the end of the discussion, there will be room for questions from the audience. If you have any questions during the discussion, please share them via the chat, and we will get to them at the end of this event. Without further ado, Dolkun, the floor is yours for opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Kun. Thank you for your nice introduction. Assalamu alaikum, is yurttaşlar. Hemen Eid mübarek olsun. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Eid. I would like to welcome all of you to this online panel discussion. Today, we are launching World Uyghur Congress 2022 annual report, which set out the most important development of the Uyghur issue, including Uyghur genocide, crime against humanity, over the past year. I'm therefore delighted to see we have such a distinguished panel speakers, each whom have made incredible, valuable contribution to the Uyghur issue. The first things that stand out when look at the annual report is what remarkable years 2020 has been for the Uyghur people. The Uyghur genocide has never received so much attention as over the past year, and the new research and the report continue shine a light on the Chinese government atrocities. The Xinjiang police file stands out as such a development. The files present the human face of the Uyghur genocide on a scale we have never seen before. Once again, such leaks only confirm what Uyghurs in diaspora and the camp survivor have been claiming for years. The Xinjiang police file provoked a strong outcry from the international community, such a resolution from the European Parliament that recognized crime against humanity and the serious risk of genocide taking place. We have also seen important development in the response from the international community to the Uyghur genocide. To end complicity in the Uyghur forced labor, the US started enforcing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, while the European Commission published its proposal for regulation to ban forced labor products. At the end, the United Nations, while visit of former High Commissioner Bachelet was nothing less but disappointing, her report can still be considered a groundbreaking movement for the Uyghur cause. We have been calling for such an assessment for years. Other important development is that M62 motion around 10,000 Uyghur refugee settlement in Canada, which was tabled by dear friends, Parliament member Samer Zubair, who is joining us today as a speaker. Today, you are welcome. Nevertheless, the filed resolution as the UN Human Rights Council showed us that much work still needs to be done. We simply cannot afford to slow down in our effort to end this atrocity. The reality remains that millions of the Uyghur Kazakh are detained or working under forced labor conditions. Uyghur children are still separated from their family. Uyghurs in diaspora still cannot talk to their family, and the Chinese government is becoming increasingly aggressive in its attempt to silence Uyghur human rights defenders. We must intensify our effort to end the genocide and the whole Chinese government to account. I'm looking for with a lot of hope to what the rest of 2023 will bring us. So we are now one delegation. World Uyghur Congress now is in Stockholm, Sweden. Last week we are in the Spain. We are pushing the lawmaker, policymakers, and the government do some concrete actions and recognize Uyghur genocide motions. So we have to work, and we have to. It is the time we are all united, and we have to all use all capacity and trying to do our advocacy work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dolkun, for these strong opening remarks. And I would indeed fully agree that while the report talks about all these important developments and also especially these important achievements that we've made last year, I think it's also very clear from the findings of the report that there's still a lot of work still needs to be done. And one of the many things that the report talks about is China's increasing transnational repression, and how this is really a development, I think, that has really risen to the fore of the agenda also for the Uyghur community in the last few years. To open a panel discussion, and I would like to turn to Mr. Zuberi. If we're talking about China's increasing transnational repression, we also see how it puts many Uyghur refugees in third countries at risk. And I would like to kind of start the panel discussion with asking you about the passage of the M62 bill, which you introduced, which exactly addresses this problem, and it has been a landmark victory for the Uyghur people. Would you be able to explain what this bill does and why it is needed, in your view?
Certainly. Thank you, Cohen, and everyone here for being here today. Attendees, Dulkin, Mr. Issa, thank you for the work you do, you and your team, and for allies for being here too, speaking in the panel, supporting the Uyghur community in your countries, in your regions of the world. In terms of the motion that we have adopted in the House of Commons as of February of this year, this motion is it has essentially been voted upon by each and every member in the House of Commons unanimously. Not a single member opposed it. And importantly, this was the first time that Cabinet and the Prime Minister voted on an issue pertaining to the Uyghur. This motion that was passed states that Canada should create a program that welcomes 10,000 vulnerable Uyghur and other Turkic minorities from third countries, meaning not from China, but from other countries, where they do face, still, they are vulnerable, where they face possible deportation to China and the camps, the forced labor camps. So this motion essentially seeks to create a new immigration pathway, starting as of 2024 and to last over 2 years. This is our promise to Canada and to the world. I encourage those of you in other parts of the world to engage with your elected officials and to ask them to either emulate this immigration pathway or really put forth their own initiatives that do address the genocide that we are talking about. Our goal and objective is simply to have these atrocities stop. Once they do stop, once the government of China stops them, we will take no issue. But until then, we will continue to advocate clearly, bravely, and courageously on these issues. And speaking about bravery and courage, I want to really salute Uyghurs for standing up and for raising the alarm. I know that it takes a lot of guts to really talk about these issues. It's emotionally taxing. I recognize that. I respect it. I ask that you continue to advocate because your advocacy is the reason why the motion that we passed in the House of Commons, M62, actually was successful. If it wasn't for your advocacy, we would not know. We would not be able to ourselves put forth initiatives. So, for the viewers who are watching, I know many are in diaspora across the world, continue to advocate in the best way that you can. Continue to build links with those who are not within the Uyghur community. Talk about this within your workplaces, in your schools, and others who have the ability to advance this issue. But getting back to the motion, this motion speaks to Canada's tradition of welcoming refugees and immigrants. We are a very welcoming country. We have a population of nearly 40 million, and our targets for next year in terms of immigrants and refugees is 467,000. That is in 1 year. And the year after that, it'll be a similar number. Into the future, we're looking at welcoming 500,000 people per year. We are a country that respects everyone here. We respect diversity. We have people of all backgrounds in Canada, and we live together in harmony, safety, and security. I want to share that Government of Canada works with our Five Eyes partners, the United States, the UK, and others in addressing the concerns around the Uyghur people and addressing the genocide. We have worked together with our allies. We have put sanctions on 4 individuals involved in these atrocities in the Uyghur region, and 1 entity also involved in the atrocities. We have recently passed legislation around forced labor, and in our budget of 2023, our new budget that was just tabled, it actually addresses the issue of the Uyghur specifically, and it says Canada is gravely concerned. This is our budget. Canada is gravely concerned by the ongoing human rights violations against Uyghurs and Turkic minorities in China, as well as by the use of forced labor around the world. Given these concerns, it's important that importers address their supply chain vulnerabilities and ensure their production promotes our shared Canadian values around the world. Budget 2023 announces that the federal government's intention to introduce legislation by 2024 to eradicate forced labor from Canada's supply chains and to strengthen ban on import goods produced using forced labor. The government will also work to ensure existing legislation fits within the government's overall framework to safeguard our supply chains. This to say that we are focused on the issue of the Uyghur. It was baked into our budget, amongst other issues. We're committed to this. Again, I'll close with saluting everyone's courage, ask you to continue to speak out, build alliances. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sabiri, for these remarks, and I can only echo indeed to applaud the bravery and the strength that Uyghurs every day are mustering in their fight for human rights and freedoms. And I think this is also something that the report really shows is that it's very much due to the advocacy for Uyghurs themselves and of course their allies all over the world, but a strong backbone from the Uyghur community, and that's really something that the report also highlights. Maybe to ask one brief follow-up question on the M62 bill, you've also already briefly talked about its implementation of getting 10,000 Uyghurs to Canada starting in 2024. I would just like to know how would that implementation practically work? Are there any concrete steps that are already being proposed, and maybe are there certain ways in which civil society will be supporting these efforts?
That's a great question. So in terms of concrete steps, I'm working closely with ministers and with parliamentarians on the implementation of this motion M62. And I personally am, and all of us, I should say, are focused on making this happen. I think it's important for people to continue to monitor and to continue to call for the implementation of whatever initiatives we are talking about, be it around forced labor, be it around immigration pathways. It's important that that the community and allies stay focused on these issues and call for their implementation, monitor their progress. But I personally am working with ministers and parliamentarians to ensure that this motion is given life.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure that definitely from the World Uyghur Congress, but also all the strong Uyghur advocates in Canada will also monitor the implementation and will do their very best to support this great initiative. And also thanks to you again for introducing this motion in Parliament. It's really been a landmark victory for the Uyghur people.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. I do have to leave in about 2 minutes, unfortunately. But I want to say that continue pushing and to always maintain hope. Hope that there will be light through this tunnel. Those who are watching this need to have that deep and firm conviction. you know that this is the truth, that there will be light after this, as difficult as things are right now. Know that, and I'll leave on that note.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sabiri, and it was really a pleasure having you join this panel discussion today.
Thank you for organizing.
Moving on to another way in which governments have been responding to the Uyghur genocide is also by making sure that Uyghur forced labor products are no longer entering this market. And Mr. Sabiri already briefly touched upon this. And throughout 2022, we've seen that the repression against Uyghurs has more and more become focused on forced labor policies of the Chinese government. And at the same time, we've also seen new reports from civil society linking various industries to these human rights abuses. In June 2022, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act came into force in the United States, which bans all imports from the Uyghur region. And in September, the European Commission published its proposal for a regulation prohibiting products made with forced labor on the Uyghur market, on the EU market. I'd like to turn to you, Hélène. Obviously, you've been very much involved in campaigning for this type of legislation at EU level. I would like to ask you, what is your first assessment of the European Commission's proposal, and in particular, when it comes to addressing instances of state-imposed forced labor, like Uyghur forced labor?
Thank you, Kun, for inviting me and inviting Anti-Slavery International to this launch today. Anti-Slavery International has indeed been a very staunch support of the Uyghur cause for the last few years, and not only myself, but my colleagues. And the work that we've been able to do at the European level has also been the result of all your engagement and all the learnings that we have received from you and from the Uyghur community. So thank you for all of that, because that has indeed helped us to advocate. At the EU level, as Kun mentioned, we have had a proposal of a regulation that has been proposed by the European Commission, which introduced a ban on products made with forced labor. This has some limitation, in particular the choice to make it product-based, which basically doesn't address the need for remediation for workers. And it also does not distinguish very clearly yet the two main instances of forced labor, i.e. forced labor in private sector, but also state-imposed forced labor. So as part of our advocacy from Anti-Slavery International and with our ally in Brussels, we have been advocating indeed for an enlargement of the scope of that regulation, in particular because the current scope is really focusing only on product line, and what we want to see for it to be efficient on all products made with forced labor is to extend it at minimum at the production site level, but also to companies that are linked to specific production sites and to specific group of product from specific region. And that's where we indeed focus on state-imposed forced labor and on the Uyghur region, for example, but also on Turkmenistan. And our call is to ask for the EU to introduce a presumption of state-imposed forced labor that would also change the way the investigation would proceed. Currently, the investigation is really like with the burden of proof on the competent authorities to do the investigation, to go on site potentially, and to engage with the companies using forced labor to try to find out about the actual situation and to incite them to provide remediation to workers. But we know very well, unfortunately, that this is not going to work in the situation of state-imposed forced labor and in the Uyghur region. And because this is not possible, we have to have that presumption of state-imposed forced labor that basically reverse the burden of proof and ask each company to demonstrate that there is no forced labor in their supply chain and that they are not linked at all to the Uyghur forced labor, the Uyghur region. Sorry. So as such, we're trying to secure those changes, those amendments. We have a few allies, I believe, inside the European Parliament that have been calling for that also. And I'm quite confident that we will manage to get a very supportive proposal by the Parliament, at least on that front. I mean, on some other fronts, it's going to be a bit more difficult. We are constrained by the legal basis, but we are also challenging that on a daily basis to make sure that we gain this. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I think that was really a very strong overview indeed of the forced labor regulation and what we here in Brussels have been trying to achieve there. You talk about, for instance, specific aspects of this legislation that you like to introduce, such as a rebuttable presumption and the ability to ban goods from a certain region or from a certain industry. Of course, this evokes a lot of this evokes the picture of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US. But of course, these are very different also in their scope. How do you see their comparative strengths and weaknesses? Are there certain lessons we can learn from the US? In what senses do you feel the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is standard setting? And in which ways might the EU forced labor regulation be standard setting? Do you have any insights in that?
Obviously, I wish I could see the future on how much the EU forced labor is going to be like a standard setting. And I hope that our advocacy efforts will lead to as many positive results as possible. I think the US Forced Labor Prevention Act has indeed been setting some standards already, because it has already shown some action, and that countries, a country like the US, but also like a region like the EU can actually have the political will and the political courage to actually go against China on this specific issue. And that it's an ethical and a human right concern that everybody should share, and therefore there's no reason why we should hide ourselves behind, you know, small words and petty conditions in a forced labor regulation. What's good with the USFLPA is that indeed it brings this presumption of forced labor, this rebuttable presumption, and that it really blocks everything at the entrance. We won't be able to obtain as wide a situation probably at the EU level. At best, we will ask and we will probably get, we're trying to get like that specific group of products, such as indeed like solar panels, such as cotton, such as tomato from the Uyghur region, and or cotton from Turkmenistan, for example, would be blocked at the entry into the EU. Where we have to also be conscious, and that's where also the interaction between the US and the EU regulation can be interesting, is that the EU regulation is not only focusing on an import ban, so on blocking imports from goods made with Uyghur forced labor, but also blocking goods that are made inside the EU in total or in part with forced labor. So it means that in theory, the EU should also not only look at any goods coming from the Uyghur region and entering the EU market, but also should, sorry, give me a second, but also should ensure that any goods that is made in the EU should not be exported if they can identify that some of its part has been made with Uyghur forced labor, which concerns, for example, the automotive industry. So how much that part will be implemented, how much that part will be enforced is another question, but that's also one of the questions we received when we traveled to the US like 2 weeks ago. And some of the US institutions were actually quite interested to hear how will we from the EU implement it on our whole market and prevent that goods made in full or in part with forced labor will reach the US borders.
Thank you, Len. And indeed, I think this is also really points to the fact that I guess international coordination and cooperation to implement and to enforce these kinds of legislation is of crucial importance to make a real difference in the fight against Uyghur forced labor. And it's not only the US and the EU, but I mean we've heard Mr. Zaberi already talk about a similar law in Canada. And under the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, we've seen that Mexico is also moving into in this direction, and I think we'll also enforce a similar import ban soon. And of course, I guess this global advocacy movement is also looking at other legislatures too and pushing for them to introduce similar bans. So I think that's a key takeaway also that we can have. And this actually also directs us to more efforts at a multilateral level, because it's not only governments that have done a lot over the past years, but also at a multilateral level we've seen a lot of new and very crucial developments. And I think it's really started with the visit to China of the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and the publication of the report of her office at the last hour of her mandate in August. I'd like to turn to Raphael now, asking you how you have assessed the role of High Commissioner Bachelet, both in the context of her visit as well as the report. And so far, do you see any changes with the new High Commissioner, Volker Türk, in his efforts to address the Uyghur genocide?
Thank you, Ken, and thank you everyone for joining this. I'm just checking that everyone can hear me okay. Yes? Great. No, I mean, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be invited by the World Uyghur Congress, who is a very close partner of the International Service for Human Rights. And we've been together on this journey, I think, for a very long time. I will firstly start saying that I would echo, I think, Dolkin's assessment that he briefly mentioned, the visit of the High Commissioner, former High Commissioner Bachelet, in saying that it was a disappointing visit. It was definitely a disappointing visit in a lot of different ways. It had been a long time that we had not had a visit by a High Commissioner for Human Rights to China. It was very disappointing in the lack of strong public diplomacy from her side in terms of the statement that she issued at the end of her visit. In particular, given the political cost of that visit and how much that would benefit the Chinese government in terms of a propaganda move. And this was public diplomacy was expected to be strong from her side, in particular because she was not. She stated that she was not there to investigate, but to talk to the government. She also stated that she would meet with civil society on the ground, but later saying that, of course, as you know, everyone had predicted and indicated to her, she wasn't able to do so safely. And she has reported to the Human Rights Council that she wasn't able to do so. And these were fully foreseeable outcomes of the visit that she had been warned about. So I think what that points to is the inconsistencies in her approach and her strategy when she was High Commissioner in dealing with the Chinese government. And I think that that's kind of like perhaps the main outcome. I mean, there were a lot of inconsistencies in terms of whether the visit would happen, and then it was out of the agenda, then it was back on. It was a very non-transparent a process, and in the end, very disappointing for that. While from the Chinese side, of course, there was a very strong PR push afterwards, or during and afterwards, which even forced the High Commissioner at that time to issue rectification remarks while her trip was ongoing. I think there was of course a very strong review of the visit and very strong criticism of the visit because of this. I think this pointed to the lack again of strategy and of understanding of what the outcome could be, and of the inconsistencies, and did affect her office's integrity, because in the end, although her office, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, so the UN Human Rights Office, precedes her and will continue to exist after her. Her position itself and her leadership had an influence and an impact. And I think this is a very key learning that I think the new High Commissioner has understood a little bit better. And one that is that even if at the UN it's really hard to close the door to cooperation and dialogue, one can still pursue cooperation or dialogue, not necessarily cooperation, but dialogue with the government, while still holding a separate track to combat impunity, to investigate violations, and to hold perpetrators accountable. And that's perhaps the biggest strategic mistake that the past High Commissioner had done. And so far, I think Volker Türk has merely not even reached a year in his mandate. He arrived with a very clear statement to the media that he would follow up on his office's report, and that he endorsed his office's report, so that kind of like to rectify a little bit the inconsistencies of his predecessor. So far, we've had quite a timid start, if I could say, but we're hoping that he will, and we will continue to push him for him to have a very strong public diplomacy on the Uyghur region, and more broadly on the situation in China, so that he can course correct a little bit. And in the meantime, I would just say that we did have, as Lokan said, a strong report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and that report has been prepared by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Of course, it needed the sign off of the High Commissioner, who gave it a couple of minutes before leaving her mandate. but still demonstrates that the OACHR, so the UN Human Rights Office, did the right thing. And despite the significant pressure from the Chinese side that one can imagine, and that is documented publicly, that it was still able to prepare and submit a report based on remote monitoring of the situation, and issue a very strong report with extremely strong findings. And again, important to note, a report that was not mandated by the Human Rights Council, which is what traditionally happens here at the UN, but it was the initiative of the High Commissioner, and that therefore fully depends on the willingness of a High Commissioner to do it. So it doesn't happen often. It does respond to the lack of action at the Human Rights Council level, but I think it's really a very important landmark, in particular if we reflect on the past 4 years, 4 or 5 years since 2018 that we've walked, and how little attention there was on the situation a couple of years ago.
Thank you, Rafael. And yeah, indeed, I guess the report, at least from the Uyghur community, a lot of people were indeed looking with a lot of hope at the report, also hoping that it would lead to very concrete outcomes at the United Nations. And for a brief moment, there seemed to be such a concrete outcome when a resolution was brought to the Human Rights Council. Even though it didn't pass, I think it's still a very significant development, and one that we've, of course, described in detail in the annual report. I'd like to ask you, Rafael, what did the failure to pass, the failure of this resolution to pass, tell you about the current situation at the UN, and maybe also about China's influence at these institutions?
I think it tells us different things. I think firstly, it teaches us to also see the UN in a way that is more nuanced and to understand the complexity of the situation. We have to state that China has a very strong influence at the global level and at the United Nations level for obvious reasons. But that needs to be nuanced, and it is with this nuance and with this complexity and with the fact that things are not as straightforward in terms of China's position and the position of other countries. This is what we're betting on for the future in terms of the international community's response. Of course, we'll start with negative, which is that first we had a draft resolution that was probably the shortest and the least ambitious text if we compare to the gravity of the situation overall, regardless of the country. But it was also one of the first resolutions addressing the situation in a P5, in one of the permanent members of the Security Council, so a major power. And it was the first resolution presented at the Human Rights Council that addressed the human rights situation in China since the creation of the Human Rights Council in 2006. So the text was not sufficiently ambitious. It didn't call for an investigation. It called for a dialogue, a first step, which is a dialogue among all countries, including China, so that this could be addressed at the highest level, at the highest global level. And of course, it's the other negative was that it was not adopted. It was particularly, I think, disappointing in terms of the role of other Muslim countries. So, we've talked a lot about this, but Qatar and Indonesia, reminding for those who are not familiar with the council that are following this conversation, that the Human Rights Council is composed only of 47 member states of the United Nations, which means that any country can speak at the Human Rights Council of the 193, but only 47 vote. So, of course, I'm sure there's many other countries that would have disappointing positions, but that were not called to vote. So it was disappointing in terms of the position of Qatar and Indonesia, who claim to protect the rights of Uyghurs, and in other countries have stepped up to protect, for instance, the rights of Rohingya in Myanmar, etc. But it had clearly failed the Uyghurs, not only by avoiding to vote or abstain, but actually actively opposing a simple dialogue under Beijing's pressure. And same goes to countries from the global south that have traditionally had a very good human rights record internationally, such as Argentina, Brazil, or Mexico, who didn't support the resolution and abstain, which didn't help it pass. And we were, something that is important to know is that we were at a very close margin of winning this. And I think this allows me to shift to perhaps a little bit more the positive, and the nuance, which is that, again, it was the first time ever we had a resolution on China presented at the Human Rights Council. And this allowed to put the responsibility on adopting this on all the membership of the Human Rights Council, who have to uphold the highest human rights standards. And we have to remember in that sense how far we came when 4 years ago states were not even brave enough to put their names on a letter to signal concerns about the situation. It also allowed us to better understand and flesh out different states' position on the situation. Given China's pressure, we had never had before non-Western states that positioned themselves, with the exception of Turkey, which positioned themselves. And now, as Human Rights Council members, because they're obliged to vote, they're obliged to take a position. And that was very helpful. And we have never reached so far in terms of responding to the situation. During the negotiations, actually, even if the text was not adopted, it was the first time the states, again, were sitting down to talk about it. And the negotiation itself forced a discussion. And lastly, also demonstrate the nuance to the assertion that China, exerts fully influence. This decision put a lot of global South countries in an uncomfortable situation and prompted a lot of discussions and obliged them to face their contradictions, but also demonstrated that smaller states, even under China's pressure, could stand in the right direction, such as Somalia, Honduras, or Paraguay, which are small countries, but still voted yes, or African states such as Malawi or the Gambia or Libya, who, despite immense pressure, abstained instead of opposing the text. So these things are very important, and again demonstrate that there's room still to work, and there's room still to leverage the principal positions of a lot of governments worldwide.
I fully agree, and I think it's interesting to kind of discuss these pros and cons, or these achievements and the failures at the same time, and then to see that indeed it's not either or, it can be both, and there can also be new insights that we gather from these efforts, and prepare, I guess, the Uyghur movement also better for the upcoming Human Rights Councils. So I think that's also something that really stands out as a lesson learned from these developments. Also moving on to you, Zumrutai, you're of course not only an experienced advocate in front of the UN institutions, but obviously also a member of the Uyghur community. So I'd like to kind of pose the same question to you, but from a different perspective. So I'd like to ask you how you feel the Uyghur community has experienced these developments at the UN. Have Uyghurs generally, or has the community been happy with its outcomes, or is there still a sense of disappointment that is there?
Yes, thank you, Kun, for your moderation, but also to all of the other speakers. And I think the UN advocacy is, I think we live in a bubble in Geneva, or at the UN in general, and I've conducted UN advocacy very closely with Raphael from ICHR over the past few years, and I think I do really want to highlight the fact that I think a few years ago, this would never, I don't think we would have imagined how far we would have gotten. Having a resolution, even though it ultimately failed, I don't think it was on anyone's mind just 3 years ago. So I think for me personally, I think for also the Uyghur community, this is considered to be a huge major development because we're tackling a huge power. And I think for those who are advocating at the UN on an almost daily basis, we know how difficult it is to change, to advocate for a country's position to change on this issue. Although we're talking about human rights issues, and we do think that human rights issues should be easier to, for countries to have a common position on, it's really difficult to work on China because you don't only face challenges in terms of getting votes on specific resolutions, but you also face threats and intimidation and reprisals because the Chinese government really deploys all kinds of resources and tactics to try to prevent human rights activists, human rights defenders to even engage at the UN level. And this is something that we've seen very much at the World Uyghur Congress, where a number of our staff members who have advocated, engaged with UN mechanisms, with member states, have faced these threats, including our President Dolkun, who has over the years been challenged in so many ways, including being expelled from the UN premises, but also, the Chinese government or the mission in Geneva has sent note verbals to different missions in Geneva to prevent the World Congress delegation to meet with diplomats and other stakeholders. So there's really a series of challenges that you encounter when you enter this world of advocacy at the UN. But I think for the world, for the Uyghur community globally, over just the past year, I think there have been huge major milestones that have been achieved, and I think it's been seen as something positive, although of course, there hasn't really been anything done at the Human Rights Council. The resolution ultimately failed. The OHCHR report came out, but no concrete action was posed. But at the same time, I think it still gave a lot of hope for the community. Seeing that the High Commissioner's Office for the first time made an independent assessment on these atrocity crimes was, I think, hugely impactful in our community. And people, I know that many Uyghur organizations and defenders have started using this in their advocacy. So in some ways, I think, although the result is not something that led to anything concrete, I think it was still significant for the community.
Thank you, Zumurtai, and I'd agree with that indeed, in the sense that for instance, if you take like one sentence that has been repeated over and over again from the High Commissioner's report is that China's actions may constitute international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity. And I think this has also really fueled the debate whether China's actions against the Uyghurs constitute crimes against humanity and genocide. And that also links to another major and I think very impactful development, especially for the Uyghur community, which has been the judgment of the Uyghur Tribunal, which found that the Chinese government is indeed committing these crimes. And I think what really stands out from the Uyghur Tribunal it's their, well, first of all, their in-person hearings, which I think were one of the first settings in which Uyghur victims themselves were given the possibility to share their experiences. And I'd like to ask you, Zumurtai, how you have experienced that, or how is that the proceedings of the Uyghur Tribunal been experienced within the Uyghur community, and in which ways has being given the opportunity to share experiences for Uyghur victims been significant in your view?
I think in many ways the Uyghur Tribunal was, I think, the first, really the first opportunity for the Uyghur community globally to even have some sort of clear format of how accountability works. I think it was the first instance where Uyghur victims were offered a platform where they could actually testify, where their stories could be taken seriously, and not just for media purposes, for headlines, but for investigation purposes, for accountability purposes. So I think it played a huge role in advancing accountability measures within our own community. And of course, we talk about the Uyghur Tribunal, how this Uyghur Tribunal is, part of transitional justice efforts, and how, of course, the judgment is not, it's not binding. But I do think that it played a huge role in advancing accountability, because it was the first time that a group of experts, which was led by Sir Jeffrey Knight, who was the chief prosecutor of Milosevic. He led a team of international experts who, for 18 months, collected, studied, assessed all of the available evidence in the diaspora community, whether it's with camp survivors, with family victims of families, whether it was with those who have worked under forced labor conditions, police officers, including one Chinese police officer who was, assigned in a camp, but also different experts, academics, and other people really looking at at different lenses of the Uyghur genocide and the different types of evidence, and really try to understand, according to international law, what are the actual crimes that the Chinese government is committing against the Uyghur people and other Turkic people in East Turkestan. So I think, in a sense, it was a very huge moment, and I think beyond even the Uyghur community, a lot of the international community, for example, we used the tribunal's judgment to go on an advocacy tour, meeting with different stakeholders, government officials, parliament members, and they were all aware of this endeavor because it was a huge endeavor, and I believe the evidence and the judgments were used in advocacy efforts around the world, and people were able to really understand, what are the consequences of these actions, and what are the laws and international laws that the Chinese government is violating, but also what charters and conventions they're violating. So I think it was really helpful to understand that from that perspective. And really, for the Uyghur community, it felt as if finally they had received their day where they could actually go to a court setting and have some sort of accountability and justice.
Indeed, and we can only hope, and I think it's also, we can even assume that it will not be the last time that Uyghurs will be heard in such a setting, and especially if you look ahead at 2023, that there's so many ongoing justice and accountability efforts. For instance, the universal jurisdiction case in Argentina, led by the World Uyghur Congress and the Uyghur Human Rights Project, but many other efforts in which civil society groups or even governments are aiming to hold those responsible to account. And I think that is really a transition that we've seen in 2022, and that we can only hope will continue and will intensify in 2023 and beyond. And I think that's something to keep looking at. We have a few minutes left for questions, so if anyone has any questions to the panelists, please put your question in the chat. I don't see any right now, so maybe I can just already ask Dolkun. Actually, you've in your introductory remarks, you've expressed hopes that 2023 will be a year in which the Uyghur movement will improve even further, and where more achievements can be made. Would you be able to highlight maybe one or two particular achievements that you would like to reach this year?
Sure, thank you, Kun. Yes, it's 2023 is very important years for us. We have to continually expand it on the advocacy work. We have seen last year is October Uyghur resolution was filed is a UN Human Rights Council. So only 17 countries support this resolution, 19 countries and against the resolution, then 11 countries abstain. So this is mean we have to do something more. So World Uyghur Congress and this, with some other affiliate organization together, 2023 we have to expand it all work to mostly global source countries, African country, Latin American countries, some of them Muslim country. As we all know, and the Chinese government really started war against Islam, and destroyed all value of Islam. Unfortunately, Muslim Islamic country continue silence or not silence and support Chinese government. This is a shame. So that's why we continue expanded our advocacy this country as well. This is also one of our planning as Uyghur Human Rights Project, Uyghur Congress, and some with other Uyghur organizations. We already started this last month and the last week. Uyghur Human Rights Project and the campaign for Uyghur, and also Uyghur study centers. They are all doing some advocacy in Indonesia, Malaysia. This is the significant, and also we have to do in some African countries, Latin American countries. This is our future advocacy work. And besides this, we have to we have to expand it all program to China's government's crime hold accountability by the international law. We already start a lawsuit, universal jurisdiction in the Argentina. We're doing another lawsuit against some government, for example, the UK. We already lawsuit is a customer border and international national crime agency. Yes, and also some other country. So 2023, and we have to expand it on advocacy work, and also we are expanded and the grassroots movement. And now is a Ukraine war starting, and now is the Sudan crisis is coming. So that's why most of some countries attention turn other parts. So that's why we are Uyghur organization. We have a huge responsibility. We are trying to use all effort to and it should not be Uyghur crisis, Uyghur genocide be put side of the international crisis. So this is the plan of 2023.
Thank you very much, Tolkien. I see that we have a question from Mehmet asking if there is a chance for the International Criminal Court to issue a warrant for Xi Jinping, similar to what has been done to Vladimir Putin. Maybe Zumratai, you've talked a bit about the Uyghur Tribunal and some of the justice and accountability efforts. Do you see this happening at any point in the future?
I think this is what we're doing, right? So we're currently in Stockholm, and we just actually came back from the parliament, meeting with different parliament members to really encourage these parliament members and these different countries to recognize this issue as an urgent issue, to pass resolutions recognizing the Uyghur genocide, but also making sure, I think Dolkun put it really well, making sure that the Uyghur genocide doesn't fall off the global agenda. Recently there was a G7 summit as well, and we've done a series of actions to ensure that, for example, Uyghur forced labor is included in these conversations, because Uyghur forced labor doesn't just it doesn't just concern one country or two. It concerns the global community, because forced labor is really tainting global supply chains. And Elen has put it really well in the beginning. Global supply chains are very difficult to investigate, but at the moment there is so much evidence that points to the fact that Uyghur forced labor is prevalent across different industries. And so I think that we're doing the best we can to encourage these countries to take a series of actions, including legislative action, but also, I think, recognition of genocide. We're starting with, of course, Western democracies. So we're hoping that in the EU, for example, a few countries can take this issue more seriously. And we, for example, one I wanted to share a development as well is that last year around this time we were in Scandinavia, in Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, to make sure that these countries take these actions. And actually recently the Norwegian parliament has organized an official hearing with camp survivors to adopt such a resolution recognizing the genocide, and it's now underway. And so these are some things that we can do, but it doesn't mean that it has to stop there. There are ways of using existing legislations in different countries to hold governments accountable. For example, we've started judicial reviews in the UK, where we are basically we filed a legal complaint to the High Court in the UK, claiming that the UK government has failed to investigate properly the imports of cotton products coming from East Turkestan. So these are some of the things that can be done, and in the upcoming years, I think we'll see even more accountability efforts, including strategic litigation, including, for example, sanction regimes on specific individuals, and maybe even legal experts maybe thinking about the same thing that was imposed on Putin, basically. So I think these kind of warrants can be explored as well.
Thank you, Zimmertai. I'm afraid we don't have time left for the other question, but I think what has really emerged from this discussion today is that we need to look beyond the usual supporters or the usual states that are supportive of Uyghur human rights, and we need to broaden their support base that we currently have. And I think the various advocates that have spoken here today really do have their sights on these states and will be making some crucial advocacy this year. So I think that's especially countries in the global south or Muslim majority countries that we need to make supportive to the cause, and I think that's one of the key issues that have really emerged from today. With that being said, I'd like to end this event here. The annual report of the World Uyghur Congress will be published tomorrow on our website as well as our social media. So please keep an eye out for the publication of the report and give it a good read if this discussion today has interested you in the work that we do and some of the trends that we've analyzed today. And with that, I'd like to thank all the speakers for joining and for giving your very interesting insights in your work and what you expect for 2023. And we definitely hope to continue the work that we've been able to do with you. And also to all other participants that have joined today, thank you for tuning in. And we hope to welcome you again during our future events. Thanks everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Kuri.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.